Well, welcome everybody to the Here Brotherhood podcast. My name is John Moore,
And I'm Mike Allen.
and we are the co-founders of the Here Brotherhood. And we are so excited to have my friend Tanner Guzy, not Guzy.
Not Guzy.
I thought it was Guzy for the first 2 years of knowing who you were, and then I met you and realized, and you introduced yourself as Tanner Guzy.
Yes, sir.
That's Guzy.
Correct.
Okay. So just a little bit of background. My older brother Joseph sent me one of your reels, one of your posts on Instagram like 3 years ago.
Okay.
And I've been following since. I read your book. And just, I guess I'll give an introduction. Tanner is the father of
Seven.
Seven. That's right.
Kids.
Wow.
Yeah.
Man, okay, I even had that. I had that
Well,
wrong.
I mean, up until 5 months ago, you were.
Okay. All right, cool. Father of 6 kids. He's
Seven.
seven. Sorry, I had it written. Thank you. The author of The Appearance of Power, How Masculinity is Expressed Through Aesthetics, and then his goal is to help men who want to dress better but don't know where to start.
Yep.
Did I miss anything? I mean, there's a lot, but anything
Pretty good, easy
essential.
summary to kind of jump in with.
Cool.
Yeah.
Okay, so we're gonna do something new this time. I want to do a lightning round. I actually have 2 lightning rounds.
Oh, all right.
Yeah, all right. They're gonna be quick. But I just thought it would be fun to get to know you a little bit. So,
Cool.
lightning round, just quick answers. Lightning round number 1, birthplace.
American Fork, Utah.
Oh,
Just down the street.
cool.
Nice.
Yeah.
What city did you grow up in?
Sandy, Utah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Languages that you speak.
English and Spanish.
Okay.
I learned Spanish in Toronto, Canada, of all places.
Why did I think it was Mexico?
I don't know, but I
Okay.
served a Spanish-speaking mission for my church in Toronto.
In Toronto.
Yeah.
Okay.
Wow.
Yeah.
All right.
Cool. Country or city with the best fashion for men?
Oh, gosh.
Or the top, some of the top. It doesn't have to be the number 1, but
Okay, very biased because there's a personal bias element
Sure,
to this with all
sure.
this, but it's always going to be Italy for me.
okay.
Mm.
Yeah.
Okay.
Cool. And we can get into that
Yeah.
more later. Books you've authored. I know one, but
That's basically it. The
Okay,
Appearance of Power.
wonderful.
Yeah, there's probably 1 or 2 others that are buried in here somewhere, but for
Nice.
now it's that one.
Cool.
Yeah.
Nice.
favorite meal? Or one of.
I'm kind of a garbage disposal, which honestly is probably like a trauma response or something else, right? But like,
I feel that.
I don't know, man. Like honestly, like I've been really experimenting with like I have one of those uni pizza ovens, so
Ooh,
experimenting
yeah.
like pizza's been a good kick lately.
Nice.
Yeah.
Love it. Go to dessert.
Always milkshakes. Especially like local, like Brooker's ice cream, like with the good milk fat and everything. Absolutely, yeah.
Okay, I'm painting a mural right now in Provo, right next to a Brooker's, and I've been looking at it like, I should
It's
try it
worth
out
it.
because I'm a
It's worth
milkshake
it.
guy. too.
Nice.
Yes.
Okay.
Nice. All right.
Last one, celebrity man crush. No, it can't be Mike. I know a lot of people answer Mike Allen, but you can't. That's not. You can't do that one.
I would say probably just because of like the elements of what he does outside of things. Like I'm
Mhm.
big in, I've been having a lot of fun with martial arts lately.
Mm.
And so the fact that like Tom Hardy does jujitsu and not only does it, but competes in it and everything else is one of those things where you go, okay, I respect that guy
That's
a lot more
legit.
than just like the cinematic aspect of things.
Yes.
Yeah.
Nice.
Cool. Any other? That's all I had for the lightning. The first lightning
The
round.
first one.
All right. No, that was fun.
Cool. Okay, well let's dive deep then. There's so many places that we could go. Where I would love to start is we've talked about this a little bit, but I've wanted to dive deeper into it because you're a man of faith, and in a lot of Christian traditions and faith traditions, there's a lot not an emphasis on style, aesthetic, not necessarily beauty, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so my question for you is, with the scripture in the Bible of God doesn't look on the outward appearance, he looks on the heart, right? There's a few things that I've wrestled with as I've read your book, as I've followed you on Instagram. How do you reconcile all that with your faith tradition? I know it's kind of a hard hitter to
No, I
start
love
out
this
with, but-
question. This is such a great question. This is actually one of the things that I work through with a lot of my clients because whether we want to believe it or not, there is always a moral element that's tied to our appearance. There can be elements of, is this shallow or is it vain or is it superficial? Or in other cultures, it's very much like, this is how you determine status and hierarchy. And we can even look at it as like, okay, look at stolen valor. If I dress like I'm a veteran or a soldier, that we see that as immoral because I have not earned the right to dress that way, right? And so I think what we have to do is we have to understand that there is an element of identity that is connected with our appearance, and then realize that I think what God is really after with all of this is he wants there to be congruence between who we are on the inside and who we are on the outside. And if we focus on the external to the exclusion of the internal, where we present ourselves as somebody who's moral or capable or kind or benevolent or just or whatever else it may be, but we don't actually show up as those things, then that's hypocrisy, and that's what the Lord is displeased with. But you look at almost any faith tradition, and there's always some manner of sacred vestment that's included in it, whether that's for the clergy, whether that's for the layman, whether that's in faiths like ours, where that's an undergarment, or in other faiths where that's worn exterior and externally. You know, you look at like Orthodox Jews and what they wear, or what different clerics or priests or anybody who really is kind of like in the clergy. And there's always an element of clothing that's associated as part of that, because clothing is used as a way to help us connect more to God when it's used appropriately. But I think it's more of the abuse of that power that God is displeased with. Then he doesn't want us to think that that power doesn't exist. He just wants us to use it the right way instead of abusing it and using it the wrong way. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I feel like that is such an interesting principle that is true throughout all disciplines, throughout anything that we use, whether it's technology or fashion, or even in the work that we're doing with meditation or any type of modality that we use. It's there's many people that use them incorrectly, or they'll point it towards self-healing rather than, in my opinion, where it's in the correct context, which is that God heals, right? So it's those certain things that lead to the correct source of healing, or are used for the right reasons.
Yes.
And when we take things out of context, or when we make things bigger than they are, or more important than they are, it almost becomes an idol, right?
Yes. This is why I love the Christian symbolism of the straight and narrow path, because the adversary doesn't care if we eschew clothing in its power and we hamper ourselves or cripple ourselves by eschewing that, or if we overly focus on it and give it too much importance. Either way, he's created a false relationship with it, and it becomes a distraction or a stumbling block. And that's the same thing, whether it's clothing or anything else that you've talked about. I think even Aristotle talks about it that way, where you can have a virtue, and if it's not done enough, it becomes a vice, or if it's taken excess, then it becomes a vice. And it's really finding, I wouldn't even say like this milk toast kind of like moderate, but really the balance of all of it, that's where it becomes a strength, and that's where it becomes godly.
Okay, so oh, sorry.
Go ahead.
Well, so I was just going to ask about balance.
Yeah.
Where do you find that balance with the work that you're doing? And also, we'd love to hear a little bit more for the listeners what you do.
Yeah, how you got there. That's literally what I was going to ask.
Yeah.
Like, just give us a little background on how you got into what you're doing.
Background
just
first,
like
and then
three
balance.
questions- just three questions
right,
in
we'll
one
just do
is
all
all.
of those. Okay. So from a background perspective, I would say that I've always been kind of hyper aware of my appearance. Especially, it started for me back in like junior high and high school, because I grew up here in Utah, and when I was in junior high, I had to go to a private Christian school. And so that was like the rep stripe tie, the white button-up shirt, the navy blazer, all of it, like the uniform. And at this time was when I was really starting to get into BMX, snowboarding, punk rock, and all. So I wanted green Liberty spikes and my battle jacket with all my band patches and all of this other stuff. And I learned very early on that two really fundamental things happened, because the people in my neighborhood would see me in my school uniform, or they would see me in my punk uniform. And these same people would treat me very differently depending on what I was wearing that day. And I would also see myself very differently depending on what I was wearing that day. And this kind of expanded into experimenting with different things in high school. One of the things I really struggled with while serving a mission was I was in a pretty strict mission where you had to like part your hair every day and all of this other stuff. And that very much felt counter to my own sense of self and my identity. And so finally, after like going through all this, experimenting with all this, trying to figure it out, going to school, I got a degree in broadcast journalism, totally useless, but I guess there's some application for what I do now. But I started a blog 12 years ago, just kind of like writing about this stuff. And it started to pick up some momentum, especially because I'm not like a stylist where it's, these are the trends and this is, but it's much more of this kind of philosophical approach, or how it relates to our identity and our sense of selves, or how other people treat us and relate to us, and how do we find the balance between authenticity and belonging and all of these other things. And a lot of people find this approach to it very unique and very interesting. And so it started to pick up some momentum and has led to a few years working in custom suiting, and now teaching guys full time how to be able to think about this in this more kind of like appearance psychology than just fashion approach type of way.
Oh, I love that.
Yeah.
So back to John's question about the balance.
Yeah.
How would you respond to that?
So this is one of the things that I'm really trying to flesh out in my own life in regards to a lot of things. And I think to best understand my approach, we'll again take it back to an element of faith. One of my absolute favorite quote, this is by Joseph Smith, the founder of the LDS Church. He says, "By proving contraries, truth is made manifest." And I love this because I think a lot of times we have a tendency to put, whether it's God or big picture things or anything else, into these very small, man-sized or like modern society-sized boxes and say that this is the entirety of it, right? Whether that's like mercy and justice, or serving but being served, or all of these other things that feel like they're completely disparate from each other. And I think very often we either go to one extreme or we go to the other, or we just say, I'm going to play it somewhere in the middle and I'm going to be moderate. But I think what the real reality is can you hold on to this extreme while simultaneously holding on to the other extreme and having the entire spectrum of it, as opposed to I'm here, or I'm right in the middle. And so balance is the fullness of it, not just one position on that lever, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, I love that. And I agree. There's something kind of a concept that Nikki, our friend, has talked about, and he leads Tai Chi in some of our retreats and things like that. But it's this yin and yang idea. He's kind of a East meets West philosopher in a sense, teacher. And so that idea of the wholeness of the yin and the yang, it's not about like, oh, I'm just going to pick what I think is good or what I think is bad, or try to avoid this and embrace that. It's actually like all of it. Like, can we wrap our arms around the entire spectrum, as you just said, and just breathe through that? And he even talks about letting the inner child lead us through that, which is such a beautiful concept. So I appreciate that perspective, and I just see these connections from other traditions as well. And I think there's wisdom in that. When you see something, a principle, a truth that resonates across different cultures and different traditions, it's like, there's got to be something to that,
Right.
So I appreciate
100%.
it. So let's talk about the work that you do and some of the principles that you help. Do you work primarily with men?
Exclusively
with men. So what are some of the things that you bring to men who are saying, hey, like, I'm intrigued by what you do. Like, how can you help me?
Yeah.
Like, where do you start?
So I focus on three things as I work through this with all of my guys. And what's fun is that every single one of my clients ends up looking different because they're all from different parts of the world. They work in different industries. They have different political or philosophical or religious beliefs. And there's not a uniform that you can prescribe to somebody about this. Right. So my job with these guys is to teach them the principles and the skill sets, and then help them apply those to what their individual circumstances are. And so there's kind of like three big picture things that go into this. The first one that's the most important is something that I call extegrity. And it's the idea of we have to really figure out who you are on the inside and then create something on the outside that reflects that. So that when you see yourself in the mirror as you're getting ready to go to work, or your family photo that hangs up over the mantle, or you're posting on social media, or a dating profile, or whatever it may be, you actually see who you are reflected back to you based on your grooming and your posture, your accessories, your dress, and all of this. And most guys, I always argue that men care about clothing way more than women do. And it's because for most women, and obviously we're painting in broad brushstrokes here, right? Sure. But for most women, clothing is something that is very easy to experiment with. It's very easy to have it be interchangeable. As seasons come and go, as trends come and go, it's very easy for them to like put on and take off and kind of like change and vary. Whereas most men, we have a sense of our identity that is infused into our clothing, which is why like a guy who's Gen X, it doesn't matter that you have to like go to some extreme to find shorts that still go past your knees. That feels like him. And so he's going to go out of his way to find a company that still sells those, even though you have to like now do more work to find that than not, right? Where, because that, again, there's that sense of identity. And so when I teach the principle of extegrity, what I've found is that most guys have something that feels congruent with who they are, but it's only congruent with a very small part of who they are. And the problem is whether that's as they've tried to experiment on their own in the past, or they've had a wife or a girlfriend or somebody else shop for them, they find things that may look aesthetically good, but it doesn't align with who they are. And so it reinforces the idea that you only get to have this small bit of congruence. Whereas what my job is to take that small bit and expand it all the way so that the entire identity is what they see back in themselves. Okay, so that's the first thing that we focus on.
I just want to comment on that real fast. I love that you pointed that out, because I do think that there is kind of a rigidity with, and this again, broad strokes, right? But when I just think of people I know, friends, whatever, there's sort of like, I will wear like this range of things that I've worn for my entire life, and anything outside of that is like ridiculous to me, right?
Yeah.
And going to the extremes to be like, no, I always wear this kind of polo shirt.
Yes.
And if I can't find it, I'm going to, where I used to get it or whatever, I'm going to go way out of my way.
Yeah.
It was so funny that you pointed that out, because I immediately thought of like,
you've got guys that come in your mind that it totally fits that, right?
Totally. It's interesting.
And there's nothing wrong with it. I think rather than kind of like, and with a lot of guys, as I call this out, they feel like I'm like there's an element of shame or belittle or no, it's like, no. Your clothing should absolutely feel like who you are.
Yeah.
But we need to, one, better understand who you are, like do a lot of the inner work, like the stuff that you guys talk about. And this is actually what I do with a lot of my clients. We'll spend 2 months going through all of this internal stuff to even understand who they are before we can start looking at how it looks externally, right? But then it's the combination of both of those. You got to know who you are, and then you have to know how to reflect that back in. And so guys are already intuitively doing that, but they're just doing it to such a small, limited extent. And my job is to help them expand on it.
Cool.
Yeah, and get to that deeper sense of identity,
right?
And see, is it still aligned, or is there an adjustment? Yeah, that's interesting.
And what's so cool about it is once that starts to click, there's this really almost, it's hard to quantify. You can't put numbers to it. You know, it's like you 10x your business, or you make 40 grand more this year. It doesn't work like that. But there's this very palpable sense of coming into your own and more of this embodied confidence, more of this kind of integrity, and really feeling like you're being honest with yourself and you're being honest with other people in a way that you weren't even aware didn't exist until you start to get a feel for what it's like now that you do have it. And so it's really fun to watch the click happen with my clients, and everything just opens up for them in this way that they just never would have expected, because they come into it thinking it's just clothing. Why would it matter that much?
Right.
Yeah.
Cool. Okay. You were going to go on to
the second one, right? So that's everything related to our sense of self. But the other thing that we have to factor in is how it actually relates to our communication with other people. Because clothing, appearance, grooming, all of this is a visual language. This is one of the things that I talked about. I got to do a TED Talk a couple years ago, which was a really cool experience. And visual communication is one of the most basic things that exists in the animal kingdom. And for animals, they use their visual communication to basically communicate, I'm dangerous, or it's good to have sex with me.
Yeah.
Right? It's either mating or like territory guarding.
Sure.
Right? And we develop entire languages out of this. You know, where rather than it just being those fundamental things, we can look at things like if you speak the right language, you know somebody's rank in the military purely just based on what you see on their collar or on their chest. You could see acts of bravery or heroism or anything else. We see this in different communities where suiting is still applicable, which for the most part that isn't happening anymore, right? But you see this with the size of the lapel, or how big the pick stitching is, or like, does it have cuffs or pleats, or all of these little variables can become entirely different languages. I think things that will resonate a lot of times with guys when they kind of like step out of clothing is think about it from the context of the vehicle that you drive, the type of vehicle you drive, what kind of tires it has on it, the year, the color, the interior, all of these things. Like that is a visual language that we all speak fairly universally. Watches, all of this other stuff. And so the next thing that I do with my guys is, as we get this part figured out with who they are internally, then we have to figure out what the language is that's spoken in their world. And this is where things get really tricky now, because you go back 100 years ago, and in the West, everybody wore a suit. We all spoke the same language, right? But because of social media and the internet and globalization and balkanization, we have all of these kind of like sub-tribes, and you have to learn your tribe's particular language and how you use your clothing to signal things like status, credibility, trustworthiness, authority, these variables that most men are interested in being able to communicate, but you speak a different language in this group versus in another group. And so it's teaching them how to speak that visual language and develop that visual literacy within whatever their particular groups are.
So how are you taking people, are you kind of like showing examples of here's like, how are you educating them on this?
Great question. What's fun about this is that my guys are in such disparate groups that I don't have that intimacy with each one.
Okay.
You know, like some of the extremes that I reference fairly frequently is like, I worked with one client a couple of years ago who was ex-Amish and owned a roofing company in Wisconsin. So very like blue collar, rural, small town. His visual language is very different than another client who is a defense attorney in Las Vegas, right? And they both wanted to communicate very similar things, but their languages, and I'm not familiar with either of those tribes or either of those groups, but by talking with them and helping them develop the ability to see and recognize what that looks like in their colleagues, in their competitors, what they see around them, and giving them the ability to start to recognize that, then when we can work together to be able to help them like flesh out what that language is and how to speak it more fluently themselves.
Okay. So it's more of helping them become more aware of their culture or their circumstance.
Right.
Okay.
And that's always my whole goal, is to get my guys to the level of self-sufficiency where they don't need me anymore. I see it like being a dad. Like my job is to make myself become obsolete.
That's cool. Okay. And is there a third?
There is.
Okay.
And this is just like actually understanding the aesthetic principles.
Okay.
Because style is a form of art, and understanding things like what colors work on you, how big patterns should be, things like the golden ratio, all of these other little variables. And not only knowing how to use those in the way that it works, but also how to like intelligently break those rules, right? Because you can think about it very similarly to music. You know, if my 5-year-old daughter goes over to my guitar and just starts like playing on the strings, it's not music, right? But if I'm
at least not pretty music,
it's right. But if I'm playing and all I've ever heard is a major chords, and then somebody else comes in and they start playing minor chords, it's still music, even if it's something different than what I'm used to. And so it's helping these guys understand, I guess, visual theory the same way that you help somebody else understand music theory, so that they can create something in a major key, a minor key, in a waltz time or a 4/4 time or whatever else it may be that actually works with their tribes and with their own extegrity. But it's giving them all those foundational visual principles so that they can then create what they want to with it.
Yeah, cool. Okay, I know you've already touched on this, but I just want to like nail the answer to this question, which is, if there's somebody listening that's like, why does this even matter? Like, why do I even care? Right? Like, how would you answer that? Why does this matter?
So it depends on how they ask that question.
Okay.
Because I have some guys who ask that question very defensively and belligerently.
Sure.
And then my answer to that is, don't worry about it. You're not ready for it yet. I spent a lot of my time trying to convince guys that this stuff matters. And I found that that energy is better gone into their own self-development and something else. But the guys who are thinking about it from a genuinely curious perspective, the best comparison I can make is, imagine if you had gone your entire life not learning how to read and write, and you'd functioned and you'd been able to do fairly well with it, but then somebody gave you that skill set, how much would that open up your world, right? This is the same thing. It's giving you that visual literacy to where you've been able to totally function without it, 100%. But as you get that development, you're going to have a stronger sense of self. You're going to be better able to communicate with the people around you, whether that's from a leadership perspective or from a rebellious perspective or anything else that happens in between there. Most of us want to be able to have some measure of influence in our lives, especially on the people that matter. And this can facilitate more and better influence, whether that's as a father, in your business relationships or romantic relationships or anything else. And so the reality is it just amplifies all the good things that you're already doing, is why it matters.
No, so I asked that question not from my own, place of curiosity, but as a brand, we're both in branding,
Mm-hmm.
and this is a total reflection of the principles of branding, right?
Right.
It's like you help an organization figure out who they are, what are their core values, how do they operate, what are they trying to do and accomplish, and
Mm-hmm.
all of that. What's the competitive landscape? You look at how every other brand is showing up, and then you figure out, okay, this is your niche, and this is how
Yes.
you're going to reach your audience, and this is the authentic expression of
100%.
who you are. And so it's literally just applying those same principles to the clothing I'm wearing.
Yeah.
Do you get into like hairstyle
Absolutely.
and facial hair and
Yeah.
all that stuff?
Tattoos, all of it, because
Okay.
it's all part of it. It's all part of that visual
Yeah.
storytelling.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think there's maybe just a general kind of lack of education or awareness about this with men. Again, this is a huge generalization, but
I think that's a fair generalization, though.
yeah, okay,
Totally.
okay.
Yeah. And it's interesting because we're in kind of a unique time in history with this. This is one of the things that I hit on the book a lot, is if you zoom out and you go to any other culture at any other point in history, and men are very aware of this visual power, and they use it very deliberately and very intentionally. And the irony is that one of the things that we get from more of that kind of like belligerent attitude is always real men don't care how they look.
Mm-hmm.
And the irony is that when you zoom out, the class that cared the most about it was always the warrior class, right? It's the most masculine men that were always the ones that were the most fixated on what their clothing represents to themselves and communicates with other people around them. And so we're in this weird kind of like cultural anomaly of a time where the thing that you have to intentionally communicate with your clothing, which is still very intentionally communicating, is indifference. So like the uniform is indifference that you have to intentionally put on, which actually is not indifference at all, right? And that's kind of the irony of where we are.
Well, when do you think that shifted? Because I look back at every decade, and it's shifted from the 50s to the 60s to the 70s, and I loved going back to see my parents in the 70s, and my dad. Oh, I got to show you pictures. My dad had this red velvet suit, and he was fit, and it had frills, and it was, I mean, very worthy of being made fun of.
Yeah.
But also highly respectable.
Yeah.
He looked so good. But I look back at that, and I feel like, I'm looking at it on a granular American level. I know it's different across the world, but it feels like there were trends that everybody got on board with. You would see the suits in maybe the 40s and 50s, and then we started getting into different things, and then all of a sudden, but people followed those trends up until then, like the 2000s, and then all of a sudden, what changed? All of a sudden, people were in sweats, and some people were looking like people from the 50s, and then you had all of a sudden everybody was trying to dress like every decade. And
right.
When did that start to change? When did we stop caring so much about?
So I think there's a couple factors that come in here.
Okay.
And do not take this as, canon, because I'm still trying to figure all this out myself, right? I think the first thing that really started, the first thing that happened was the sexual revolution and the idea of just fundamentally changing culture in general and a complete like rebellion against everything that came before. Because prior to that, culturally, it used to be you appreciate what your ancestors did and you built on it. You appreciate what they did and you built on it. And then the sexual revolution in the 60s kind of came and said, middle finger to all of this. Everything about the past is backwards, and we're gonna change that. Okay, so I think that was the first like nail in the coffin. I think the second thing is what a lot of Gen X guys experienced growing up, and I'm kind of like an Xennial, so I got a lot of this growing up, was the idea that the lamest, worst, stupidest thing you could be is sincere. And so you have to be aloof, you have to be indifferent, you have to be above it all. Like think of The Breakfast Club.
Yep.
Right? And like being the jock or being the nerd, like you don't want to be either one of these guys. You want to be the rebel, you want to be the guy who's aloof and above it all. And this was very much like the cultural programming that we got. And so you had to wear that uniform of indifference, right? And then I think it really solidified even further when we saw the when I think Zuckerberg was really kind of like a big deal with this, where it used to be that if you were a big mover and shaker in macro culture, that one of the ways that you signaled that was by dressing in a certain way that reflected dignity and status and everything else. And guys like Zuckerberg and Jobs and Bezos and others, their flex was
T-shirt and jeans.
I can wear whatever I want. I'm so powerful that I can do whatever I want. And then you have all the guys that wanted to emulate that, that became their uniform, which is very much what we see here in Utah in the tech space and everything else. It's kind of like this uniform, again, of indifference. And I don't wear suits. The guys who work for me wear suits, right? And I think you could even kind of tie it to like some big macro cultural changes where we've gone from being a dignity culture into, I think we have two kind of main different drivers, and they're very opposed to each other, but you have an attention culture and a victim culture. And both of those are very opposed to the idea of dignity. And so it used to be that it was high status and humble and the right thing to do to dress in a way that was dignified, as far as like you treat yourself with dignity and respect, and you also want to dress in a way that treats everybody else with dignity and respect. But now it's anybody else who judges me for the way that I look as a dick, and I don't want anything to do with that person, right? So it's the opposite of dignity in that regard. And I need to dress in a way that gets as much attention as possible, or I'm a victim of this and this and this and this, and so I need to dress in a way that reflects that victim status as well. So I think all of those things are kind of what led us into the current condition that we're in with this.
And probably the opening up of the world through social media, of seeing suddenly millions of people all doing different things and different, cultural influences and whatnot. That has to be a factor with this kind of like disparate diversification of
which is interesting because I think we're actually seeing the opposite. Have you guys heard of the concept of flattening culture?
No.
So it's one of these things that if you go look at, you go into old cities and you see that even like, I noticed this even last time I was in Pisa, even like their manhole covers are beautiful. There's art and there's intentionality and everything that goes into it. And now everything is just like, it doesn't matter if you're in Provo, Utah, or Chicago, or Bangkok, or wherever else, coffee shops, they're all going to look the same. It's all going to be the same bland, minimalist, just very like Apple Store aesthetic, or you can't tell the difference between most major downtowns anymore because all the skyscrapers look the same. Right. And we're seeing this with music. We're seeing this. And I think clothing is a symptom of this as well, where as we get more and more globalized, and it's ironic because it's under the name of diversity, but we actually become less and less diverse, and everything becomes more and more homogenized as it goes.
Interesting.
Fascinating. This all just is so fascinating to me.
So could you just humor us real quick?
Yeah.
If you were to give an assessment of John here.
Oh, gosh. No, no, start with Mike.
No, one of the things that I will notice about both you guys, and I think this is one of the first things that I look for with people, is there's a level of intelligence and deliberateness in how you dress. Like neither of you comes across as apathetic or indifferent about it.
Phew.
Yeah, right? But like
Good.
even, okay, John, with what you've got on, like, yes, it's a t-shirt, but it's a heavyweight, right? There's a little bit more drape and a little bit more of that weight to it. The ball cap has this kind of like classic element to it. Even the fact that your watch is a tank style as opposed to something else reads as very deliberate. You guys won't be able to see this on camera, but we were talking about this prior to the show, where he's got these great, right? Yo, get those up. But these like light wash, straight fit jeans.
No. I'm stuck.
Don't fall. With a raw hem where, you just cut them off and let them be frayed and all of that. And so I think that this is like, there's good intentionality there. There's things that we could do to play with it to add a little bit more. Like one of the things that you could do, especially with how like oversized is good, especially with your build and where the trend is and things like that. But like, just cuff your sleeves to add a little bit more intentionality, and you can
thought about that this morning,
right?
but I didn't do it.
Just do it, right? Like that's a really
funny.
easy tweak that we can make. Or like you, for example, you were wearing the hardest thing for guys to pull off, which is a short sleeve button down shirt. It's so hard because most of us look like we're swimming in it. But yours, like, notice that the sleeves fit right in the middle of the bicep instead of coming all the way down to the crook of the elbow. And they're not so big that it looks like you've got these little like noodle arms that are flailing around in it or anything else like that. Or your grooming is totally on point. And I love the fact that you're embracing the gray rather than, because this is one of the things I think most guys don't realize, is that gray for us is actually a very good signal, both in sending signals to other men, but also to women, because we're valued for our experience, our capacity, what we've accomplished, and all of this. And so when we're young, that's all a complete untested potential, Whereas if you've survived this long, you're still attractive for this long. Like those are all good genes. It means you've done good things for yourself. Like all of those are very good signals. Okay. Some tweaks that I would recommend is you've just got your collar button undone. I would undo one more button. And then for an undershirt, I wouldn't do a crew neck. I would do something that's like a tank top or like a V-neck or something else so that you get less of that visual like chopping off and it flows things. And then by undoing one more button on the shirt, a lot of times we look like we can't quite commit to being dressed up and professional or dressed down and casual. And so it looks like you're treading water. Whereas if you undo one more button, then you're leaning into, I'm totally casual, I'm embracing this, and I'm wearing what some people would feel like is a uniform because it has a collar and buttons, but I'm wearing it because I want to, not because I have to. And so that's a little subtext that can be communicated that way.
Fascinating. Like the fact that you just whipped that out.
I know. It shows your expertise. No, I've been thinking about it the whole time. I'm like, how would he break this down? I do want to. This is fascinating stuff, and I know we could talk about this, and it'll continue to weave in. But I did want to talk and shift a little bit about just some of the personal story and things that you've been experiencing and going through, because I know just lightly, right? I don't know everything that's been going on, but I know you've had to really face some difficult challenges, some serious things
over the last few years.
Yeah, and I think obviously given what our organization is about and the work that we are involved with and the importance of connection and brotherhood and facing ourselves and doing the work, I just wanted to open that up to you wherever you want to take it, wherever you feel comfortable taking it, with telling us a little bit about like the personal journey that you've been on.
Yeah.
Wherever you want to enter into that.
Cool.
Can I give a plug
Please.
somewhere along there?
Yeah.
I remember, because I've been following you for a few years, I remember at one point you changed your tune a little bit. And specifically towards therapy. I remember at one point you kind of came out and said, hey, I've been going to therapy, and I know this might be weird for some of you to hear that because there's such a stigma around it. But I remember appreciating that because you are such a masculine figure, right? And for more men to come out and just share that with the world, that was impressive to me. I felt that was really helpful for hopefully a lot of your followers who might be weary of that.
Yeah.
So maybe that's a good place to start.
Yeah. So to give you a little bit of context and even kind of like why this has happened, I've had a few different things that have really kind of like blown up within the last few years. About 7 years ago, my brother, who's 18 months younger than I am, we shared a room. We were really close, and both close competitively and close, collaboratively growing up. He started to experience some real mental health stuff, was homeless for about 5 years, and then 2.5 years ago, he ended up taking his own life.
Oh, man.
Which is, hard for anybody to really kind of grapple with and wrestle through. And as this was happening, I was in the middle of my marriage starting to fall apart. And this was related to a lot of the dynamics between the two of us, but a lot of it related to different things from both of us as far as family of origin and things like that. And so she filed for divorce a year ago. And so within a week, both of these were just this past May, she gave birth to our 7th child, and our divorce was finalized.
Wow.
Yeah. And so I've been kind of in the thick of a lot of heavy stuff and having to work through and walk through all of this. And when my brother's name's Trent, when Trent really started to grapple with a lot of this stuff, I don't remember how we got turned on to it. I think it was my buddy Mike Cernovich who turned us on to this book called Hold On to Your Kids, which is, if I remember right, I believe it's Gabor Mate, who's one of the co-authors on there. But the premise of the book is the idea. Yeah, he's great. But it's the idea of like peer orientation versus parent orientation. And so that's what kind of like started everything down the rabbit hole. And then, you go from that to like body keeps the score and all of this somatic stuff and everything else. And so I've had a really interesting journey going through different therapeutic modalities, EMDR, internal family systems, all this type of stuff. And I don't know where I am with all of it still, because I would say the two things that I'm most concerned with, and this is why I'm still struggling to find somebody that I feel like I can truly partner with on it, is one, the main thing is most of my experience with working with different professionals is that they treat men like we're defective because we don't operate like women.
Mm.
And I think that that's why a lot of men are very leery of therapy. Is I don't want to go in and talk to somebody who tells me that I'm wrong because I don't operate like a woman does. I want somebody to help me be my best as a man, not LARP as a woman. And that can be really tricky to be able to navigate. And then I think the other thing that becomes a problem for a lot of us, especially for men of faith, is that therapy can become a false god. And a lot of times, whether it's the principles themselves are flawed or the way that they are presented can be flawed, and it becomes a contradiction to these core principles that we're rooted in our faith. And my experience has been a couple times where people that I've been working with have been antagonistic toward me because of my loyalty toward my faith, rather than helping me be able to find, because I'm of the opinion that if these principles of therapy are true and real, then that means God designed them, which means that there is a way to be able to use these and work with these within the way that he wants me to. And if these are true, that also means that Satan is going to twist and pervert them and convolute them because he doesn't want anything good to exist. And so it's finding somebody who can help me either see them as they are without, or help me work them in within my faith. And that continues to be the challenge in both of those.
Yeah, I appreciate what you shared there, because I've had similar explorations, even with practices like meditation, with breath work, with yoga and Tai Chi, like all of these traditions. And there's these great value in those practices. And when they really became powerful for me and more alive for me was that side kind of integration, rather than keeping those disparate and separate. And that might rub some people the wrong way, of maybe it's not being fully respectful to like the whole yoga tradition and religion or whatever. But I see all these parallels and all these connections, and have been taught many of them from people who understand these things at a much deeper level than I do. But drawing those connections and parallels for me has allowed me to really lean into these practices in a way that kind of fits within my belief system, my framework, my faith, that has not only made those practices powerful for me, but has enhanced my relationship with my own tradition and with God.
Yes,
and
because
so
they're not mutually exclusive.
Exactly. Yeah. So I appreciate that perspective. And I think in therapy modalities, I see a lot of those connections happening as well. Even in just the process of identifying lies or false beliefs and finding truth and finding healing. But as John mentioned earlier, not to mistake the therapy itself or the tool itself as the thing that heals, right? And so it's like, well, that's a tool, and it points towards, for me, it points towards a higher power.
Yes.
And so, yeah, I wish you the best in your search for figuring out the connections there.
Well, so just kind of piggybacking off of that, it's interesting. The first time I was invited to attend a breathwork session, holotropic style, where you're laying down and you're breathing in a different way than we normally do. I remember going to an event. It was my very first time, and I was hesitant, but I show up, and it was an interesting, a fascinating experience. And it wasn't necessarily my style looking back. There were people that were like waving some crystals around, and there were a few things that I thought, this doesn't, if that works for some people, I'm not going to judge that, right? That didn't quite align with me, and I think going to this point of almost a misdirected healing. It's looking maybe in the wrong objects or the wrong things to find the healing, and instead using these things as a way to connect more, whether it's with self or with God, or both, or with others. And so that experience versus a few weeks later when I went to my first breathwork session with Mike, he brought it in a really well-rounded approach to it. There were some quotes from David O. McKay, who's a religious leader. There were quotes from Buddha. There was science involved. There was lots of different faith traditions and cultures that, I remember thinking, man, I can't really I can't really go against this. I can't think of any way to feel like this doesn't align with me and with my faith traditions. And so that experience was so powerful because of the way that he set up the space for that to happen. And within those bounds, I've had some of my most powerful experiences and connections with God. And I think that's almost a parable of what we're talking about, of just the right context. And where is it leading? How is it is it encouraging connection? Is it encouraging connection to God and to self and to others? So I think this is such an interesting topic, especially with what you do and with what you've experienced, is just the context and what is it leading us to connect to?
Yeah.
What do you find has been most helpful for you, having navigated through some choppy waters, some major turbulence?
Parts work through internal family systems has been really good. Kind of like identifying these different parts, and for me, being able to I think a lot of times what I have a tendency to do is to look at these protector parts as kind of like my own internal antagonists to like the inner child or the true self. And it's like, no, I don't want to just now make you the exiles, but it's like, I want to actually partner with you guys and integrate you and everything else with that. So I think that that's a big aspect of it. Better understanding my attachment style has been fascinating. Especially now being back in the dating pool and recognizing how much that all comes into play from a dating perspective and everything else. And
Will you explain
super
that?
fun, fearful avoidant.
Will you explain that just a little for those that aren't familiar with IFS?
Yes.
Just the attachment style.
Oh man, and I'm going to butcher these
And
because
it doesn't have to be clinical.
Okay,
Just
so internal family systems is the idea that you have different internal parts. And I think most people recognize, like, sometimes you internally talk to yourself, right? And it's the idea of these different disparate parts within you that are talking to you. And some of them are designed to protect you, whether that's from aspects of your past or currently the way that things are. And sometimes those different parts can get a little overzealous in those jobs. And the idea is, and then other parts of you have been exiled because you are ashamed of them, or you've been, through your experience with other people, you've been taught that those parts of you need to be hidden away. And so it's the integration of all of those different parts, the recognition of and integration of all of those different parts. And, you know, for me, one of the things that I found is, even when I find these parts, if I sit down and I like draw them out and what they look like, if I were to like see them on my body, what they look like, or those things, it kind of helps make them feel more real, and it makes the integration stuff easier.
I love that you'd be like, and this is what they'd be wearing.
right. No, for me, it's really
very detailed.
For me, it's because it's not actually like, it's not actually people. This is totally, you know, like a tangent, but it's like, you know, for some, it may be, like it's this gaping hole in my chest that represents fear, or it's like these like hard steel, like a crown of laurel leaves that represents my intelligence. And so it's all of these different things that kind of embody these different parts of what I am. And
interesting.
As far as like attachment styles go, man, there's a whole rabbit hole to go through with that. But basically, and I've even started to figure out how this relates to clothing and your relationship with your clothing. But the 4 different ideas are secure, which is what we want to be. Then you've got anxious, which is where basically you are constantly needing validation and approval from other people. And most of the time that comes from self-abandonment. You have avoidant, which is that intimacy is terrifying. And so the idea of getting close and connected to other people means danger. And so you become overly self-reliant, and you're constantly pushing other people away.
Those are the lone wolves.
Those are the lone wolves. And then you have the really super fun one, fearful avoidant, which is what I am, which is elements of both.
Fantastic.
I want you, no, screw you, you've done everything wrong, right? So even understanding elements of that, because the goal is to not just say, you know, hi, my name is Tanner, I'm a fearful avoidant, like this is the identity,
Right.
But it's, how do I recognize why I am this way, and then get back into get into a secure place. And then I would say the most important thing, whether, you know, even more so than internal family systems and attachment styles, has actually been, from a therapy perspective, they call it somatic work. For me, it's going and just getting violent with my friends every morning at the gym, right? For me, it's been Muay Thai and Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, where I've done a lot of different exercise modalities. I've done half Ironman. I've done multiple Spartan races. I'm I'm in the 1K club with strength training and powerlifting and stuff like that. Like I've kind of experimented with all of it. There is something, especially from a brotherhood perspective. All right, I'll get really weird with you guys on this. Okay.
Bring all the weird.
Right. And I want to be careful with this because I know immediately guys are going to take this in a sexual direction, and it's not. I think that there's flip sides of the coin because we all know that there's a physical intimacy that comes with sex. There is a very similar physical intimacy that comes with engaging in violence with somebody where you know them on a very different level than you ever would otherwise. I remember the first time I had a boxing bout, like I felt so connected with this guy because we just spent 3 minutes beating the hell out of each other. And it was a very weird thing to feel that kind of connection. Like I know him in a way that like there's this really weird connection. And I find this when I go train in the morning with the different guys at the gym is I will spend an hour getting my arms cranked or choking somebody or getting choked or anything else. I don't even know half these guys' last names, but I feel a brotherhood with these guys that is very different than when I go sit in elders quorum and talk about the plan of salvation again for the 19th time. You know what I mean? Like it's just a different level of, and I think that this is actually kind of one of the diabolical things that we're dealing with is that we have had both violence being maligned and any sort of physical connectivity being related to sexuality and homosexuality to where it is so uncomfortable for guys to get into that space and we miss out on that connectivity. Like the three of us should be able to wrestle like as buddies and not have there be any connotations, whether from a violence or an erotic perspective, but our culture will see both of those or either of those. And it limits our ability to connect in the way that we should.
Yeah.
So powerful. I remember that we had a here event at what is it called? Wasatch
Combat Sports?
Yeah.
We did
it.
This.
Yeah,
cool.
and it was very beginner. But I know what you're talking about. Just that intimacy that you feel as you're kicking each other. As we did kickboxing and
even the footwork. It was almost dance like.
Yeah.
You know.
But it's interesting going back to your point. We steer clear of that as men. But you look at history, you look at all the battle buddies in war. You look at, I mean, even cycling clubs. Shout out to Lauren Krieger. We see it all over the place. Run clubs, and I feel like it's making a comeback, especially with social media. Yeah, thank goodness. Fight clubs. I think it's necessary for these types of things to happen because we have such a history with masculinity, especially since the 60s and 70s, where it has been this anytime you're close with a guy or any hugs or any whatever, all of a sudden it's there's this separation or this fear of somebody thinking you're gay or thinking or whatever, right? So I think that's it's such a fascinating comeback that we're seeing, and I'm so glad. There's so many men that are in our community or not that talk about this, how necessary it is to have these connections, yet we can't talk about it.
Nope.
For fear of whatever. In our society. So I think it's fascinating and I hate to say brave, but I think it's a courageous thing to talk about. So thank you for bringing that up. And I think it is something that's so essential. And we talk about that all the time. We have, at our retreats, we have one coming up in November at Zion's Wildflower, if you've heard of that. Zion's Wildflower Resort. And it's been an interesting experience to keep experimenting with these retreats. And one of the things that's been the most impactful is these moments of even, the cold plunge where we're getting in the water, we're doing something hard. And where I met you at the beginning of this year was a collaborative event of suffer together. This idea of doing hard things together. And exactly what you said, at our retreats, doing breath work together, doing these open shares, even sometimes having our arms around each other as we're supporting a brother. There's so many of these moments that I feel like society has missed out on for the past 20, 30, 40 years that is making a comeback. And I'm so glad because I need it. And I'm not afraid to admit that. I think we all need that in one way or another, even the lone wolves.
Yes.
I've seen some lone wolves who thought that who would be that way to their grave that have come out of obscurity and realized I need this connection way more than I thought. And I think it's such a critical thing. And so I love all of the things you're talking about and how that applies to what you're doing as you're fighting in the gym. And I've always wanted to get into MMA, to kickboxing. I always love those activities. We need to do another kickboxing event,
Well, I
because I
think what
just
would be fun-
love the fighting, going back to being a little kid. And I have
Yes.
4 boys, and I watch them, and they're trying to murder each other on the daily. And sometimes I think, man, I want to just go fight somebody.
Well, and I think that this is one of the things that I'm still trying to work through and figure out that makes it even trickier. And this is what would be cool at an event like the retreat. I'm going to tell you how to do your job. Not
Please
that
do.
I have any idea.
No, please.
But it'd be really cool at something like that if you just brought in a few different mats and it's just open for you to go do when you want. Because there's a big difference between, I think it's very easy for us to recognize, like, oh, I'm going to go get good at this sport because it's self-defense or because it's tough or whatever else, and I'm going to get good at it, versus the spontaneity and the play, because that's what you do when you're little kids with your brothers, your cousins, your friends. Like, I'm just going to take you down and we're going to wrestle. You know what I mean? And so it'd be really interesting at an event like your retreat if you just had mats where it's like, no, we don't have anything specific for, like, where we have a black belt that's coming in to instruct us on, like, the right kind of takedowns. But it's like, no, dude, like, go wrestle with your buddies and, like, have some fun with it. And this is just a space where that spontaneity and, like, come up with your own competitions or things like that. But I think that that's one of the things that I know that I'm still missing is the play component of it versus just the training component of it too. Yeah.
There's, I think, another angle on this too, which is that sort of physical, somatic, the almost violent, like, release of something, right? And that's maybe not in the play space, but it's more in the, I have this pent up, whatever it
We're
is.
physical beings.
Yeah.
And we have had that, this is not a pejorative, this is the actual, like, we have had that retarded in us as a generation, because everything we do is in our heads, especially with, you know, social media and our phones and everything else. And I think that's one of the reasons why we have so many problems with whether it's ADD or depression or all of these other things. It's because there's, and again, you know, you go back to somatic or the body keeps the score, all these other things, is that our bodies are holding on to all of this stuff and they need aggressive and playful and everything, you know, contraries. We need everything on that full spectrum to be able to actually exist in a healthy way. And we just do dopamine hits on our phones instead.
Yeah, totally. And then when we're triggered by whatever happens, there's not a, you know, you think of the fight or flight response, there's usually a physical component to that. I'm fighting and there's an exertion there, or I'm running and there's an exertion
and we
there.
don't get either of those.
Exactly. Yeah. So that idea of it's just being pent up. And so I've seen some and heard from even people in our community, like Ian May, shout out to him, who does, he's a strength training, like bodybuilder type of guy, you know, and he talks about doing mindful exercises or squats or whatever, and he'll just start to cry because, like, something has finally come up and out, and it's through that physical exertion, and then there's an emotional release. And I'm just like, wow, that's a powerful thing, you know. And I've seen it even at I went to another men's retreat where they did a lot of physical activity related to people's traumas. And so, you know, one guy got the boxing gloves on, and someone else
through it all.
And it was pretty powerful. I mean, I've had my own kind of mixed feelings around, like, what does it look like to have sort of a violent expression, and is that a healthy thing? But I think it's all about the container you're in and being in that safe space where this is a place where it's allowed to come up and out. But then it's not like, oh, now I can just let that come up and out.
You're not
anywhere.
developing the skill set so you can be chaotic with it.
Exactly.
So that you can channel it in the right ways.
Exactly. Yeah, well said.
And have it prepared for when the few times where you might have to be violent to protect, which is innate in us as men. We have to learn how to be violent so that it is ready for the appropriate time.
Totally.
Yeah.
Okay, we're running out of time. I feel like we could talk for 5 hours. I did want to do a quick little lightning round before we go.
Number 2.
Yes, lightning round number 2, and this one is called what did I call it? In or out. So you decide whether it is in or out.
Okay.
Obviously, this is a personal preference. So don't be offended if you're listening and you have a man bun. But we'll start there. In or out, man bun.
If you are under 200 pounds and over 30% body fat, out. Otherwise, you could pull it off.
Wow. Okay, that's very specific.
Very specific.
Basically, do you look like a Viking or do you look like a soy boy?
Okay. I love it. Cut off jeans for men. And I'm saying that personally from today.
This is hard. This is very contextual.
I know there's
but-
so much.
I know. I thought it was
based on
going to
what
be
he
easier.
shared,
Yes
right?
or no?
He's like, it's not about
It's
trends.
all
It's about
contextual,
Yeah,
right?
I know.
For most guys out, but I can see guys, yourself included, that could pull this off.
Yes.
Yeah.
That's all I needed. It's made my week. All right.
what have you done?
I know.
Just kidding.
Okay,
You're gonna
men.
be jorts next.
You should see what I'm
Oh no.
changing into. I cut them a little too short, but they're my painting pants. All right. Anyway, okay, men crying.
Men crying in or out. Interesting.
Yeah.
This is a good question.
Some of these are trick questions, and this might be one of them.
Can I have this not be a lightning answer?
Sure.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. We have a few more minutes.
Okay. I think the idea of men crying is a very interesting thing, because I think that we're in a space right now culturally where you're almost kind of like emotionally manipulated into crying, where you're not doing the healing work. You're still like an old school brute or something else. And so it's almost like we've built in this new shame around not expressing emotion that way. And my experience is
Almost
that
as if you're not feeling if you're not
Exactly,
crying, right?
Right.
Okay.
And my experience has been in a lot of cases where it becomes, and I think this is where, if you treat men like we're defective for not being women, then that becomes a problem. But I think the counter side to that of, it's only appropriate to cry at your dad or your dog's funeral is
Right.
also pretty stupid. And so I would say that if that is, I think we all are born with different levels of like emotional sensitivity. Sure. I'm highly sensitive. I have a son who's highly sensitive, and
Same.
right. And I think if you were wired that way, then there can be healthy and helpful ways to cry, and you should be able to do that. And if you're not that way, and your natural disposition is not to do that, that doesn't mean that you are emotionally stunted or stupidly stoic or something else that way. Yeah.
I appreciate the
Yeah.
thoughtfulness
Yes.
in your responses here. Yeah.
Yeah, I wasn't expecting to have. I was expecting yeses or nos, and then in the
None
middle,
of
I'm
these
like,
are in or out questions.
Well, the more we got to know you, I'm like, I don't know if I should do these lightning questions. Yeah.
Everything is context.
Okay, in or out therapy. We've already talked a little bit about it, but I just thought that'd be
in
fun.
on the right modalities. Out if you are making it your core philosophical belief, or if you are not working with the right therapist.
That's
enough.
deeply how I
Yeah.
feel. Okay, believing in God.
In.
Sweet. That was a trick question because it's always in.
Yeah, and this is kind of interesting because, I have some friend, like I have one friend who used to be a priest in the Church of Satan and then now runs like a solar cult and everything. But
Wow.
and he's such a good dude. It's like so fascinating in these different ways. But the idea of unapologetically believing in something bigger than yourself, whether you fully believe in God or you just believe in like human or masculine idealism, like believe in something bigger than you.
Love
Cool.
that. Duck Dynasty beards. Length beards.
Get a little Duck Dynasty ZZ Top out.
Were they ever in?
Yeah, I mean, again, depends on the right
1800s
context.
maybe?
I'm sure that we'll
Okay.
see that come around at some point, just like the big, mutton chops
Sure.
or whatever else, right? Yeah. If you would have told me 15 years ago that just straight up mustaches were going to be in again, or we were going to have a new iteration of the mullet, and then, everything comes and goes in cycles.
Yeah. Okay, last question. What is something you're seeing today that you know in 20 years we're gonna be cringing at? I always like this question.
Like a style.
Yeah, what do you see now that you're like, that doesn't work today nor in 20 years?
Not a timeless look.
Yeah.
Honestly, this is not.
I felt that way
thing.
about rompers
Yes?
for women.
Oh.
I'm like, how's that working for anyone?
Okay, here's a hot take for you.
Okay.
I actually think that from a bodybuilding perspective, the over focus on the size of your chest is something we're going to look at 20 years and go, those guys look ridiculous.
Interesting.
Yeah, because again, you go back to like classic bodybuilders and things like that, and there were like healthy proportions, and now it's gone the other direction. And I think at some point we will get to the point where it either continues to go there and it gets more excessive, but we'll look back at it and go, that's disproportionate. That's not what we're after.
Interesting. Yeah, it was a unique take. Appreciate it.
I wasn't expecting that. I love it. Well, we are out of time, but thank you, Tanner, for being with us today. Where can people find you?
Yeah, absolutely. Which thank you guys for having me on.
Yes.
Really fun conversation. I am active on X, Instagram, and TikTok, and all of those are at Tanner Guzy. It's TANNERGUZY. You can go to masculine-style.com, or you can look up The Appearance of Power, and that's available in paperback, or if you want to hear my sweet dulcet tones read it to you, you can do that in an audiobook too. Yeah.
Cool.
Awesome.
Well, we'll make sure to put that in the show notes.
Awesome.
Yeah, thanks so much.
Thanks, guys.
It was awesome.
Appreciate it.